Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Americans take democracy for granted. For many of us, the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall signaled that liberal democracy had won. And yet, just a few short decades later, we seem to have become a highly divided society where democracy appears to be in peril. The information revolution facilitated by the internet has led somewhat paradoxically to us being more informed and misinformed at the same time. And a misinformed public does not bode well for a healthy democracy. So what should we do? How do we turn our differences, our diversity, and our pluralism to our advantage? Joining me today on Brave New World to answer this question is Ali Velshi, veteran journalist and a longtime anchor at MSNBC. Ali has worked for a number of networks during his career, including Al Jazeera and CNN. He's hosted a number of shows covering business and social issues. He's the first journalist on Brave New World. Ali, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
Vasant, it is great to be with you. Thank you for inviting me.
I usually start by asking people to say something about themselves, and sometimes I discover that we have things in common. So, why don't you just go ahead and tell us something? You're a media personality, so you're well known, but, tell us something personal that most people don't know about you.
Well, what most people don't know is that I'm an immigrant. I guess people do know that. And I often tell people how I came here from Canada. But in fact, I was born in Nairobi, and I was born of parents who were from South Africa. They were anti-apartheid activists because my grandfather was Gandhi's youngest student at his ashram in South Africa. So my family had been seeking out sort of a better life since the late 1800s from a little village in Gujarat when they went to Africa, and then they moved from South Africa to Kenya, and then they moved to Canada, and then I moved to the United States. So I am fascinated that 50 years after my parents first landed on these shores, I have spent the last year or so, maybe more than that, really, looking at the potential fracture of democracy in America. I had sort of assumed that by the time my family landed in North America, the quest for democracy was over, that it's here, it's not going to go away. And I have to tell you, I'm now in a place where I'm not 100% sure about that. I think that this democracy is more fragile than we think and requires work on all of our parts.
An association with Mahatma Gandhi. Not many people can claim that. So we'll get back to the subject about democracy because that's clearly front and center in what I want to talk to you about. But, how about that? We do have something in common, right? So I spent 3 years of my youth in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, where my father was a military attaché. And I would get invited to Haile Selassie's palace on the Ethiopian New Year.
Wow.
And so, I was invited 3 times and I shook hands with him twice, which has endeared me to the Rastafarians. So the first time I went to Jamaica and I told them that I had met Haile Selassie, they said, "Oh, you met God, man."
That's crazy.
And yeah, so how about that? It's amazing how you just find things in common with people. I had Paul Sheard on the show, who's a common friend, and we discovered that we've both done the London, India route overland.
No kidding.
Yeah. In the 70s, before the Soviets moved into Afghanistan. And
right, you could do that, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And things erupted in Iran and all of that stuff. So that was shortly before that I got that in. And I have to say, it was a life-changing experience for me.
I can imagine.
As it was for him. Yeah, so let's talk about democracy. But I guess before we get there, just tell us a little bit about how you view the role of media and the different degrees to which it is trusted in different parts of the world. Because, you're a global citizen.
Yeah.
How do you view the role of media and its nature in different parts of the world?
Well, I think it's a universal, right? I think it's like physics or spirituality. There should be 2 things that journalism does all over the world. The first one is to bear witness, to simply show people what is happening around the world, to demonstrate whether it is how authorities are conducting themselves or natural disasters or famines or elections, whatever it may be. The second one is to hold power to account. Media has more information, and by virtue of being able to bear witness, to see things that are happening, we have the ability to hold authority to account, to say, hey, this is actually happening. You can't cover that up. What are you going to do about it? To speak for those people who don't have a voice. I think that's the universal of what journalism should be. The issue is that media is bigger than journalism, and media is also entertainment, and media is political, and it's advocacy work, and it's all sorts of things. I don't think that it's more partisan or biased now than it has been, because if you think through history, media has always been something that's been used by partisans and by people on all parts of the political spectrum to put a voice forward. But I think there is a trust issue. I think there's been something that's happened where we don't signpost what we're doing all the time. So people think they're watching the news or they're listening to journalists, and what they're hearing is opinion. What they're hearing is advocacy. And I think that with the internet and the speed at which content is distributed, regular folks don't have the ability to discern between those things. So you watch something that you think is supposed to be news and somehow it's opinion, and you don't know that, or you listen to somebody else's opinion and it's counter to what you've been listening. And the internet allows us to narrowcast, right? So we can now curate who we want to listen to, as opposed to generally listen to, things that used to be like broadcasters. So I think the combination of that stuff, the idea that we're choosing who we listen to and we don't know how to distinguish between news and opinion, and that media doesn't distinguish all that well for people, for its consumers, has led to this distrust of media. It's global. I mean, everybody around the world, people have distrust of media.
There's a lot you said there, and I want to try and unpack it. So, to what extent is this distrust in media driven by a perception that media is biased? I mean, it reminds me of the Big Lebowski. That's just your opinion, man.
Right.
To what extent is that contributing to this? That when we tune into a particular channel, we sort of almost expect a certain opinion or a slant. And
right.
So we're already sort of predisposed to that. And that's what we tune into because that's what we want to listen to and believe in, right? So is it the lack of discernment, or is it that the fact that people just want to listen to stuff that reinforces their beliefs?
Yeah, I think I think there are a couple of issues here. I am not nearly as troubled by bias as many people are, because I think if it's signposted, it's fine. What I want is reliability. What I want is honesty. What I want is truth. I'm happy to hear somebody's truth if they intend it to be true and it doesn't reflect my politics. I think what we've done is we have conflated bias with lying. And certainly our last president had something to do with that. Everything he didn't like was fake news, when in fact, fake news is a plague. It's a really serious problem. There's a lot of fake news out there. But someone who doesn't agree with you is not fake news. Someone who lies to you is fake news. Someone who lies about the facts. And I think it becomes very, very hard for the average consumer to discern that. So we have people on the left of the political spectrum who think that conservative news outlets lie. We have conservatives who think that liberal media outlets lie. I think the perfect world is one in which you have any number of media outlets across the political spectrum who tell you the truth. And you can then listen to them all and compare, and you can still decide you're a liberal and only consume liberal information. But we've confused bias with dishonesty. And this allegation that everything is fake news has helped that, because what it has done is it's taken our focus away from actually fixing those things that are fake news. We should all hate fake news, regardless of where you stand on the political spectrum. You should want right-wing news and left-wing news and no-wing news to all be honest, and then you can evaluate the information and make your choices about how you're going to live, how you're going to spend, and how you're going to prosper. We don't have that. It's all jumbled and confused right now. So I think bias is part of it, but I would be very happy for a world in which there was bias in journalism and news, because we know how to process bias. We can't process the combination of bias and falsehood.
So I guess some people would say, there's sort of a fine line between bias and dishonesty. I guess what you're saying is signpost your bias. That is, you're saying, look, I come from a liberal slant or a conservative slant, and so you know that, and so I've signposted myself. But within the confines of that, here's what I'm saying, and to the best of my knowledge, it's true.
I'll give you a perfect example. There's a debate in the country right now about what the minimum wage should be. The federal minimum wage is $7.25. Joe Biden wanted it to be raised to $15. Two conservative senators have put forward a suggestion that it be $10. And in a rational world, that might mean that we end up with a minimum wage of $12.50 an hour, which is a lot higher than the $7.25, right? Now, the conservative senators can say, we're conservatives. We don't believe the government should be setting minimum wages. We think that government's not going to pay the wage, so we have to be careful about how we do it. That's why but we understand that people can't live on $7.25, so here's $10. We're conservatives. We're never going to think that the government should dictate a minimum wage that's unusually high. Liberals can say people have a right to earn a living, and there's too much disparity between the rich and the poor, and that's why we feel it should be $15. Those things are both true. They're both true. Nobody's lying, but they have valid arguments about why a minimum wage should be lower or higher, and that is a remarkable conversation to take place in the public arena and have people decide, have legislators and people decide on what a good outcome is. There was bias in that argument. Entirely. And you can apply that to healthcare. You can apply it to any number of issues out there. Nobody was lying. That's my point, that we will differ on how we see the world. We should differ on how we see the world. That's pluralism. But we have to figure out how to take those differences and arrive at conclusions and progress. Nobody needs to be lying about it. We can admit where our biases lie. I'm more liberal than not. I think that that in the richest country in the world, we should have a proper minimum wage. At the same time, I'm a business reporter. I'm an economics guy. I fully understand how the bodega down the street would have a problem because they're currently paying someone $9 an hour. And if that suddenly goes to $15 an hour, they got two employees, they're going to have to lay one off. Or the prices are all going to go higher and people will buy their stuff at Amazon. I see the whole range of stuff. We need to have discussions that way without lying about it, just saying, I've got views on these things.
So what's the problem? You started by saying that your ancestors were in pursuit of better life and you came to these shores because this was a bedrock of democracy and freedom. And yet you say that you are concerned because you don't take that for granted anymore. Like, what's the problem here?
It's the same problem. It's lying. We have people in this country who believe that an election was stolen without evidence to back that up, and are now taking actions or supporting actions that are undermining democracy in terms of voting restrictions and things that are being done around this country. So the lie ricochets around the world at the speed of light. This is not an opinion about whether people should have voted for Donald Trump more than they voted for Joe Biden. That's a political opinion. That's bias. That's okay. That's what our systems are based on. But we have been lied to, and lots of people believe these lies because of the way in which we have come to consume information, because of these silos that we have, because we look at Facebook. So I meet people, for instance, who expound theories that are conspiracy theories, QAnon conspiracy theories, and I ask them about QAnon. They don't know anything about QAnon. They don't believe they subscribe to QAnon. They just saw it on their Facebook feed. And this information gets out there, and I don't know why we're suddenly taking a non-critical look at certain information, but it affects democracy. Democracy does, to some degree, rely on an informed electorate. And now, without an informed electorate, you are seeing support for initiatives that will actually erode democracy. And that's my concern, that we're actually seeing democracy eroded by its own citizens, not by a dictator who came into power because people are believing dishonesty. They're believing things that are simply not true.
So is this essentially because of social media?
I think a lot of it is social media. I think it's the internet generally. So I don't know if you had an internet where you didn't have social media, where people can curate their own news, whether this would have happened in some other form. But the concept of social media allowing you to curate where you get your news from places more responsibility on the consumer of news than has ever been placed on them before. It used to be broadcasting, right? So you might have read the liberal newspaper or the conservative newspaper, or you got your news from NBC or ABC or CBS, which were all the same largely. Now you can curate so specifically to your friends or people who are like you or like-minded that you're just absenting yourself of critical arguments on the other side, or even the fact that there might be some truth on the other side. So I think that social media is a very, very large part of the problem. Not just because of the curating, but because of the fact that, like everywhere else in life, a lie spreads faster on social media than it does in the non-digital world. So I do think it's a big part of the issue.
So, you said two things there in the last couple of minutes. One is that democracy relies on an informed electorate. And I asked myself, are the citizens less informed today than they were, let's say, 40 or 50 years ago when I first came to this country? And, in a sense, I believe that Americans are actually much better informed about lots of things, including other parts of the world. When I came here, people had no idea. I mean, many of them wouldn't actually have been able to identify India on a map. Yeah. I mean, Americans were generally not really aware that much about the rest of the world other than Europe. And so in that sense, I feel like people are actually much better informed than they were 40 or 50 years ago. But then there's another thing you said, which is that it puts the onus on the recipient of the information. At that time, you had CBS, NBC, the three broadcasts.
You had no onus, no responsibility. You just listened.
Right. And then you had the independent channel, which you could watch The Odd Couple or stuff like that, right? So the sources were actually few, and you generally tended to trust them, that things had been well curated. Whereas that's an interesting point, that there's just so much onus now on the end user to sort of parse through whatever, the bias, the untruths, and all of that it's probably just like a lot of information overload.
So at the risk of becoming esoteric, I think that you're right, that the average American is better informed than they were 50 years ago. They're also more misinformed than they were 50 years ago. And I think both of those things can actually be true. There's much more information, and a lot of it's really good, and a lot of it's really bad. And asking people to figure out how to parse that on their own is real work. Now, it's real work we should actually do, which means we probably need to be teaching either in school or at a community level how to consume data, how to consume news, how to consume information. No one taught any of us how to do it. You meet any 12-year-old kid, they can teach you how to use the phone and they know all these apps and how to get stuff, but nobody actually taught us how you should consume information differently than you did 50 years ago. And 50 years ago, the news was being curated for you. Now you have some responsibility to curate your own news feeds. And if you do not know how to do that, you just follow and click and follow and click and like, and you end up with a news feed that is not perhaps as broadly spread out as it should be. It may not be self-correcting. So that's the problem. We didn't tell people how you're supposed to operate in this new world where you get information differently, yet information still hits people. And I don't think they know what you're supposed to do with it. What's supposed to bounce off? What are you supposed to challenge? What are you not supposed to repost or share or like? Because half the damage just comes from people who had no bad intent, but they spread bad information. I think this concept of management of information and information intake is something nobody's taught us how to do, and that's the danger.
So I want to come back to that, because this has come up several times with people in contexts similar to this. I had Jonathan Haidt on the show a month or so ago, and he was talking about how social media could be contributing to teen girl depression, like how it differentially affects teenage girls as opposed to teenage boys, because they are consuming information in a certain way and really getting impacted by having certain expectations that maybe don't pan out.
Right.
And interestingly, just a few days ago, I had another guest, Brian Christian, on this show, and we were talking about, artificial intelligence and machine learning. And he informed me that Facebook actually now uses something called reinforcement learning algorithms in order to curate the feed on your mobile device, right? That previously they used to sort of show you something that you had a high chance of clicking on, right? These were systems that would predict whether you would click on something or not, whereas now they've become a lot more sophisticated, because reinforcement learning is really all about reinforcing certain behaviors that lead to sort of goals that you desire. And they've actually figured out through these algorithms how to actually do that, which really gets me to a question that I was actually going to start with, which is, do social media companies have an inherently more powerful business model than what you have, right? Which is broadcast media, right? You're saying, well, we're curating stuff. We are making decisions as to what to show. And, you probably confront this every day. Like, what am I going to talk about tomorrow,
Correct.
right?
Yeah.
And so you're making this decision every day, what to curate. Whereas, you're up against machines
Yep.
that are making this
Yep.
decision based on a ton of data about everyone, and they can personalize that to you and actually show under the radar, show you exactly what is going to engage you, right?
Yep.
So do you sometimes feel that you're up against an enemy with just superior weaponry, to use a military metaphor?
Yeah, I mean, think about this. If I were in the Roman Empire, I would be a town crier, right? I'd be the guy who reads the news. And my curating of that news is very similar to how the town crier would have done it, 2,000 years ago, right? Everybody has more news than they can tell. And you have a certain amount of time in which you can talk. It's the same way every museum works, right? They've got millions of things in storage and hundreds of thousands in the basement, but they can only show you thousands or hundreds at a time. So I have to curate in the same old-fashioned way to say, look, I've got rudimentary data. I've got ratings that say this segment rated well, this one didn't. But I don't have any detail about why this one didn't rate well. It could have been that the day turned out to be nice and people wanted to leave and get going with their day. I don't really know very sophisticated stuff about it. The social media companies have such remarkable detail on two fronts. One is they've got machines that evaluate your actual behavior, and two is they've got your data. So even if they didn't have the machines that evaluated your behavior, they have enough data about you to be able to predict your behavior. And so you take all that and put it together, there's no active curating that needs to be done. And that's the heart of the issue with social media, right? And the spread of misinformation, where there are people who think they need to be regulated. Regulated to do what? Regulated to take responsibility for the information that is disseminated on their platforms. And their arguments are, no, that's not what we do. We're a platform. We don't make determinations about what's out there and what you consume. You make the determination about what's out there and what you consume. That is a very, very hard thing to compete with, because my old-fashioned bespoke curation, which I think is of some value, and now only matters to people who know who I am and say, I like that Velshi guy. I like the way he thinks about things. For most of the world, that's not relevant.
So do you buy this argument that when are telling you how to consume stuff, you make that decision? What do you think of this argument from social media? That, we're just a platform. We're just like putting stuff out there. And now there are all these hearings around Section 230. I don't know whether you know my views on it, but what do you think? I mean, do you buy this?
Well, so the way I think about this is on several levels, right? Backpage used to sort of hide behind Section 230. And in that case, they were very aware that they had a website that was peddling, that was involved in trafficking of underage children, which is entirely illegal. And they knew it was happening and they didn't take any action. And they said, we're just a platform. That is fairly clear to me that that's not what Section 230 was designed to deal with. So I see that differently than I see Facebook and Twitter and how they deal with 230. One of the problems I think we have in regulation, and I probably believe that there's more of a role for regulation than some people do, is that we don't really have the experts in place to handle that regulation. Every time we have a hearing on social media at Congress, it becomes very, very highly politicized with people who don't seem to have any meaningful ability to understand the sophisticated stuff behind what social media is and how it's used and what these algorithms are. So I think what's happened is tech has become so much more advanced than our legislators have that while I believe there should be more regulation of social media, I am very worried about how ham-fisted that could be. So I think the jury's still out. I think we have to have some general agreement on what does success look like with respect to social media. I'm a very big First Amendment freedom of speech person, and I don't believe that we should be doing anything to curtail or infringe on the freedom of speech. At the same time, I do think that there are responsibilities that need to be held by social media companies because of the power that they have. Just like I'm a regular media company, we have certain power, so we've got certain responsibilities. And those responsibilities and regulations need to be limited. And it's a sophisticated discussion that I worry that we're not equipped to be having right now.
So what do you think? Do you think that these social media platforms are hiding behind Section 230?
Yeah, I do. There has never been an issue on which I am on more sides. I really see the value in the arguments that the social media companies are making. I see the value in the arguments that the Roger McNamees of the world are making, or the Europeans are making, in terms of what they regulate. I think that the public is not 100% clear on what regulation will do for them in terms of privacy versus security. I think we've got a generational divide amongst young people who are absolutely prepared to give up more than an older generation is in exchange for a highly functioning internet. I think we've skipped this conversation entirely. So now when we end up talking about Section 230 and social media companies, I would say 9.5 out of 10 people have no idea what we're talking about. And in a world where we're so polarized and everybody is meant to make a decision based on their political party really quickly about what right looks like, this would be a dangerous one, right? If we end up regulating social media and hence speech and communication incorrectly, this could hobble us for generations to come. So I think we really have to think about this one very carefully.
Indeed. But on the other hand, I think that if we do nothing, we see which way the train is headed as well.
Correct.
Right? So, I mean, you talked about that you're sympathetic to some of the arguments from social media companies. Like, which ones are you sympathetic to? Because I just have a problem being sympathetic to anything they say, other than there should be free speech. You know,
right.
I mean, yes, I buy that, but
I think you're right. I think that's the basic argument. I'm a pro-free speech guy. So most things start there with me. But I have lived in other countries where there is ostensibly remarkable freedom of speech that somehow manages to steer clear of some of the problems the United States gets into. So we do know what hate speech looks like. We do know what dangerous things are on the internet. We do know that we have algorithms where we can determine when things are getting out of hand. Now, again, out of hand is a loaded term, but I think I would appreciate if the social media companies could say, this is not an absolute. We are platforms, and we are not there to regulate speech or to manage speech, but we understand that there are places that we need to be involved. For the public safety, for the safety of democracy, there are things we need to do. Certain things in America, certain things in other countries, and what do those look like? The idea that they hide behind either free speech or Section 230 to not take responsibility, and yet they are at the center of so many dangerous things that happen, worries me a great deal. On the other hand, there was an incident in it was Christchurch, New Zealand, where a guy strapped a camera to his head and then went up and shot up a mosque. And immediately people were saying, YouTube has the ability to identify when someone is shooting a gun and killing people and should have been able to stop the streaming of that, which sounded like a really reasonable argument. And then I had all sorts of people emailing me and tweeting me saying, I'm a mother of a black son in America. The only hope I have of him not getting killed by police is that if he can stream, if he gets pulled over. And if YouTube suddenly decides, or Facebook or whomever decides that when they see a gun aiming at someone, they're going to cut that feed off, that is my lifeline. I had protesters in the Middle East and in Iran saying, you cut off the ability to stream, our movements are dead. So these are sophisticated discussions about technology, about freedom of speech, about danger, about responsibility, and about media. And I don't think anywhere in our government have we had any conversation that in any way reflects the complexity of this issue. I think there are a handful of United States senators who understand the complexity of this, if that. I think there are fewer United States representatives. And in the end, if we're making laws, they're the ones who are making it. And I'm not fully comfortable that they're well informed to make these decisions.
So my question would be, where do we go from here? But before I ask that question, I just want to respond to a few things you said. So, I remember the first hearings in 2018 where some of the questions were, I guess, less than sophisticated, like, how do you make money? And Zuckerberg saying, well, we sell ads, Senator, right? And then last year, I was actually pleasantly surprised by this committee headed by Congressman Cicciolini that actually showed fairly remarkable understanding of the nuances. Now, not to say that it didn't turn into sort of a partisan thing, because it did, but under all of that, I sensed that there was an understanding, a fundamental understanding as to what the problem really is, and actually acknowledging that we've got a problem. So what do we do about it? And I want to run something by you that I ran past Sinan Aral, who was on the pod a few months ago. And he also pointed out that you have to remember that in certain parts of the world, Facebook is the internet.
Correct.
Right? That these platforms are tremendously useful to people in managing their lives and earning a livelihood.
And in the support of democracy in some of those places.
Indeed, right? But let's turn our attention to the United States, which is really seeing some difficulties in regulating this sort of new beast and even how to think about it. So I want to get your thoughts on something that I've pushed for a while, which is that I don't know what the right regulation looks like, but I think the financial services industry, which you know a lot about because you've covered finance, actually provides a good blueprint for thinking about how to regulate social media, right? I remember in the 90s when a lot of the dealers would behave badly during the times when people actually would call in orders over the phone, and when the market was stressed, sometimes dealers wouldn't even pick up the phone. Or they'd like throw an order into the trash, right? An order came from a customer. There was actually no way of ascertaining that they were, fulfilling their fiduciary responsibility to the client. And the regulators came in and said, no, this isn't going to work. We need more transparency, right? And in the financial services industry now, I find that it is regulated to the point of, if you're going to contact a prospective client, well, you need a record of that to show a regulator why you did that, who you contacted, everything. There's an audit trail that's required of everything they do. And it's actually led to a lot of good things in the financial services industry. I think things have become better in many respects due to the increased transparency. And the financial industry is one of the most deeply regulated industries on the planet, and for good reason. It involves people's money. I would argue that social media is actually equally important, if not even more so, in that it is presenting a threat to democracy. And yet we give social media companies a complete pass when it comes to transparency.
Yeah.
That somehow it's okay for algorithms to be black boxes and doing their hocus pocus behind the scenes and sending messages under the radar, whereas it's not okay for humans, right? So the way I look at it is we are subjecting machines to different standards than we are humans. And I think that is part of the problem. So John and Mary out there, well, when they do something, it's all recorded, right? But when algorithm number 53 and number 2009 do something, they get a free pass and no one can see what they did. To them, transparency means giving you choices about how you curate your news feed, but there's zero transparency about what the algorithms do all day long. They're putting lipstick on a pig. Hey, guess what? It's okay. It's a black box, and that just sort of happens. And this is something that I feel that social media companies are just so dishonest about. And so to them, transparency means, oh, sure. So Jack Dorsey says, sure, we'll let you figure out which algorithm, like how you want your news curated. But that's like putting lipstick on a pig, the way I see it. Essentially, there's still stuff happening under the scene that no one really understands.
So I agree with you. Yeah, I think if the social media companies were ahead of this, if they were to say, if we could do this the right way, then we could get ahead of regulation. Because one of the things with your financial example is for years, for decades, regulators were not paid as well as the people who were designing ways to get around the regulators. And they still aren't, frankly. But that was a problem, right? Financial engineering and technology was ahead of what people could regulate, what we learned very clearly in 2008, 2009. That's where we are in this side of things. So I think you put your finger on it. These companies, these tech companies, are not behaving like good citizens. If they were to say, we get what the problem is, and we have the smarts and the technology and the people to fix this, and let's come up with something. But what ends up happening is it's not just lipstick on a pig. Well, I guess that's a good analogy. They come up with things that look like solutions that aren't. And anybody who's a little bit smarter than I am can look at it and say, well, you didn't really solve that problem. You're not even really admitting that you're in a problem. So that's part of it. They come up with this milquetoast stuff that attempts to deal with some things, and it's not sufficient. So they are prodding regulatory-minded people to do this. There are some people who say, let's leave them alone. They can probably figure it out on their own. But they demonstrate that they're not able to figure it out on their own, or that they don't actually feel it's all that important to figure it out. And hiding behind 230 and the idea that their platforms is tone deaf. The idea is, if you'd like to evade harsh and inefficient regulation, why don't you come up with something that looks reasonable? But every time Facebook does it, it's like, guys, are you kidding me? Do you think we're all idiots? Once in a while, they do something that is interesting, but that's exactly the problem. I'm worried about over-regulation of things having to do with speech, but they're not giving me any reason to say we shouldn't continue to think about ways to regulate it. So this is the rock and the hard place. They deserve some regulation, and we deserve legislators and a public that understands this conversation well. But this conversation that we're having right now, or that we have with Sinan, or we have with Roger, or people like that, is not a conversation that a lot of people are having. And this is yet another one of those things that has fallen into this polarization, this political polarization we have. So people have views. And I found this when I've traveled across the country for the last year talking to individual Americans. And the number of people who've told me their views on social media because they censor conservatives. They couldn't tell me what they're talking about, what that censorship looked like, or what's going on. But as a result, those companies should be regulated. Well, I'm not sure that's the reason I think social media companies should be regulated. I'm not even sure that's true. But we end up with weird, strange bedfellows because of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the wrong conversation as to whether they're like against conservatives or against liberals.
But half of America is having that conversation.
I know, and the trouble with that conversation is that it continues to let these platforms get away scot-free and sort of focus on the wrong thing. And as long as that continues, they don't have an incentive to fix the problem, right? I mean, I would bet money that Senator Warren's statement that, let's take Google, that Google is a referee and has players in the game, is probably true to a large degree. If they were in the financial industry, they would get slapped with fines so large for operating the marketplace and being market makers in it, right?
But we would understand that as antitrust. We would understand that as anti-competitive. We are having trouble as a body politic in understanding the control of information that way, right? Once we decide that information is like money or like oil, we'll be able to figure this out.
Exactly. And by the way, it didn't take rocket scientists to figure out what kinds of regulation we needed in the financial services industry, right? I mean, it was obvious, right? It was obvious that they would behave badly as long as they had the incentives to do so, as long as they would do everything to satisfy shareholders. And so as long as they didn't have the incentives to fix the problems themselves, they didn't. And the solution, like I said, wasn't rocket science. It was like, hey, I think we just need transparency, and we need to make sure that we have the mechanism to enforce that. And guess what? Hey, technology is here now, right? We didn't have the technology in the 60s and 70s to be able to do that. But by the 90s, we certainly did.
And no one suffered financially for it. For all the warnings that you're going to over-regulate financial services and it's going to suffer. It didn't happen. There's more money going through these companies than there was when we thought they were a systemic danger in 2008, 2009. The same thing can happen for technology. Regulated well, we don't have to stop or slow down the flow of commerce or information or business.
Right. And to me, regulating well means transparency, is the first thing, but not transparency of the sort that they kind of gloss over, but actually recording everything that is done by the algorithm. It's like regulators having an API into Facebook or Twitter that says, you know what, I want to see all of the messages that your algorithm sent out to this segment of the population between this time and this time, right? And that's not that hard. The technology exists to do it. It's not rocket science, and it should be obvious. And the other benefit that would come out of that is that we would finally have the data, that is the scientists, and people like Sinan talk about this, that we need better information. Well, we would have that. We would have access to the information. I think anonymity and all of those things can be sorted out. The technology is good enough for that. I just sort of come back to just basic blocking and tackling. As long as we have the ability to actually see what you're doing, you can have your algorithms and your secret sauce and all of that stuff This is a free country, right? Do it the way you want.
The problem here is that this is an important conversation that the public should be involved in, right? And there are people who try and get the public involved in it. But what our former president did better than anyone else is he somehow brought this topic to the fore. But as you said, having the wrong conversation without censorship of conservatives. And so you've got a bunch of society who's all up in arms about how we should regulate the information industries and the tech players, but we're not actually having the right conversation. So as much as there is a legislative responsibility to regulate and an economic incentive to regulate, what we don't have is a common understanding in society. And in my opinion, and you tell me if I'm wrong, this isn't even a partisan matter. This shouldn't be partisan. There are probably a range of views on what regulation should look like, as there has been through all of history, whether it was financial regulation or regulation of the oil industry or the phone industry. We've always had a range of views. There are those who want a more laissez-faire, hands-off view, and there are those who think they should be fully regulated. And we have come to agreements on that over time. That's what this conversation needs to look like, not some weirdly partisan political conversation where we do end up with strange bedfellows, but a highly informed public conversation that says, this is what good management of your data looks like. This is what good security looks like. This is the role government can play. These are the things government should have no role in. And if people have special sauce that they need to provide, that's okay. We don't need to get involved in that business. But this is how we keep society and politics safe.
Indeed. In fact, the financial industry regulation was hardly partisan, right? I mean, that was like, it's obvious that we need more transparency and accountability. And it doesn't matter whether you're Democrat, Republican, Independent. This makes sense, and we should do it. So in that sense, I think we're at that point in the social media industry as well. We just need to be having the right conversation. So I want to pick up on one other thing you said, which is this onus on how we consume information. And I agree completely. We've gone from zero to high speed in this sort of brave new world of information, of too much information. And yet our attention is limited. That's ultimately what's limited. So whose responsibility should this be to educate people about how to consume information? Is this something that we start teaching students in high school?
I actually think younger, because you're way earlier than high school when you start using a phone now, right? So on one hand, I love this topic. And at the end of it, when I talk about fake news and disinformation and misinformation, people say, what do I do about it? Well, short of regulation, there's nothing you can do about it except this on your phone. So I tell people, triangulate your information. In the same way the phone knows where you are on Earth because it hits 3 towers, you can identify a spot. Find 2 other sources to every story before you send it out, before you talk about it. So if you see this very compelling story about a pizza parlor in suburban DC in which they are holding children as sex slaves in the basement, before you do anything about it, like the guy who went out and actually took a gun and might have killed someone, just check to see if anybody else has it. Because as partisan as you think, as biased as you think the media is, MSNBC had that information, or the New York Times had that information, we wouldn't be holding that back. We'd be reporting on it. So if you see a story that only exists in places that are known for their biases, you have to triangulate. It's a little basic thing. Before you hit send, before you hit share, do it. Well, whose responsibility is that? I don't know who's supposed to be responsible for it, but the only people who can stop the spread of misinformation is you at the moment. I'd like a better solution than that. And maybe that solution involves algorithms and apps and reliability measures for journalists. So you can say, I'm very conservative, or I'm a libertarian. I want the best libertarian takes on wages, health insurance, whatever it is. I want the most honest and reliable journalist from the most honest and reliable outlet, right? So that'd be fantastic. So you can choose me for the fact that I don't have to issue corrections. My stuff is fact-checked by the crowd, and I'm reliable. So I would like a reliability score of 100, and I'd like to be working for a company that has a reliability score of 100, wherever I am on the political spectrum. So I think the media has to think about this, and it has to be done as a public trust, because I don't think, maybe it's owners of media have to come together and say, we'll provide some method of checking reliability, not bias, reliability. And then I think we have to teach this to kids in school at a very young age, before high school. What does responsible consumption of information look like? What's required? What apps should you have? What's dangerous? What do you look for? And it'll evolve over time. And if we do it all over the country, it'll evolve 50 different ways or 5,000 different ways. And maybe that's okay. Maybe we'll figure out best practices over 5 or 10 years. But I think it has to be taught before high school. And separately, media has to take some responsibility to manage it as a trust. Never mind social media. Regular media needs to sit there and say, how do we give people who can't do the work on their own because they're busy doing their day jobs the ability to easily determine the reliability of the news that they get? Not curate. That's somebody else's problem. Determine the reliability of, the veracity of the news that they get.
Yeah, well said. In fact, as I was listening to you talk about the fact that this should actually start early, it makes me realize that actually it's now become a fundamental parental responsibility. I mean, we've always been...
But how do you teach? I don't know what to teach my kids. So the point is, that's the danger, right?
Exactly. But it's almost like you have to educate the parents as well, on how to, teach kids from a very early age, how to be savvy consumers of information, because it's almost like as important as learning math, or learning how to read.
We teach civics and people read the Pledge of Allegiance because of some fealty to democracy that we have. Well, if you think democracy is that important, then we need to teach information consumption, because that imperils democracy much more than you not reading the Pledge of Allegiance or not singing the national anthem. Your democracy is actually imperiled by garbage information that's out there. We should be thinking, as we think civics is important, this may be the component of civics that's most important.
In fact, people talk about democracy and rights, and one of the things I think they forget about is the obligations that come with being a citizen in a free and democratic society. And this, I think, falls on the obligation side of the balance sheet. Okay, great. Well said. So I guess I'll ask you a question in closing, which is, if you were to go back and be a child again, would you pick the same path? Would you be a journalist?
I would pick this path more today than I have ever thought so in my career. Journalists used to come to me and say, what should I do with my career? And I'm thinking of being a journalist. And, over the last 15 years, we've seen declines in circulation of newspapers and revenue and, the decline of local news. And I always told people, I said, if you're that smart, go back to school, study something else, become a doctor, become a lawyer, become a scientist, do something else. This is not necessarily for you. This is a hard career where they don't pay enough money and it's losing respect in practitioners. It's now a noble profession. For all the people in the world who think that we're a den of liars and thieves, real journalism is a noble profession. And I would do it again, because if you believe that we are here to bear witness and hold power to account, there's much more going on in the world to which it is imperative that we bear witness, and there's much more power to hold to account. So I truly believe this is a calling now, much more than I ever believed when I first found myself on the way into this profession.
So what advice would you give young people who want to get into this profession? What would be a good, potentially successful career path for them? Right? Because I can imagine that there's a lot of competition, lots of hurdles.
Yeah, so I think you have to understand that this is ultimately a digital pursuit now, right? So people who say, I want to be a TV anchor like you, it's like, I don't think there's going to be TV anchors after me. Maybe for a few more years, but I suspect that I'm going to live out, the best of this career. It's been on in decline in terms of viewership for some time. Donald Trump saved the industry a little bit, but fundamentally, this is not a job for TV. Everybody's multimedia, everybody's digital, like podcasting. So one has to understand that, and one has to understand the economics of that and think about it that way. But more importantly, as a journalist, as a member of the media, you need to be engaged in truth seeking, right? It matters. You have to understand that the job is not about the glory of seeing your name in print or being on TV. It's about seeking truth and helping society get to that truth. And that truth may be holding power to account and asking of our political decision makers hard questions and representing your viewers or your listeners or your readers. But I think you have to think about it philosophically, the same way that there are some doctors who go into the medical field to save lives and some lawyers who go because they believe in the justice system. This is not a profession for fame and for notoriety. It is the pursuit of justice. And I let people know that if you have to think about it that way, if you're comfortable with that you are going to become a warrior in pursuit of justice, go for it. If you're looking for fame, it's all parceled out now. It's all little bits of fame, right? You'll have fame on your particular digital channel or whatever you're doing. This broadcast fame is a thing of the past. This is about truth.
All right. Great message and good advice. Is there anything we have left uncovered here? I think we covered a lot of ground, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
Well, it's a lot of stuff. I just hope we can do this again, because it's you cover a lot of important things that I think people need to hear about. So I'm sure there's lots more we can talk about, but let's do it again.
All right, we'll save that for the next conversation. Ali, this has been absolutely a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks so much, and hope we can speak again and pick up where we left off.
I look forward to it.
All right, take care.